everyone. Thank you for coming today on this very cold day where clearly you guys are already like done with summer. I'm not. Texas is not done with summer until 2 months later, but that's okay. Thrilled to be here. And yes, I'm going to be talking about research that is done with my PhD students and other collaborators about style transfer and data augmentation for sequence labeling tasks. And okay, there you go. So I think most people here are NLPers. I didn't know, so I have this intro about what is NER. So I think that's like you all know what name entities are and why we care about them. So I'm just going to skip that one. The motivation about why we care about data augmentation or why we're doing this is because there's always a need for labeled data, like even in today's world where you have large pre-trained models that have been super successful in a lot of different things. Usually when you want to adapt these models to your specific task, your specific domain, then that's where the wrinkles become a problem. And there are many reasons why sometimes you get poor performance. There's a mismatch between the training objective of these large models and your task. There's a mismatch of domains. And so for most languages and real world applications, we really find the need of annotating data so that we can get better performance. But annotating data is expensive, and like it shows there, it becomes stale very quickly, right? And so it's like a real system, for example, needs to be updated every so on so that the model keeps performing. So this need for labeled data is a huge problem, a huge bottleneck. So there's a lot of need for how do we do better? Can we do automatic data augmentation? That's what we try to do. So the main idea on how we go about it is to use style. So we care about, can we extract the style in a domain and then map the style with another target domain and then do transformation based on style so that we can generate more data for our domain of interest. My student calls it STADA. I don't know how to pronounce that, but you know, stands for Style Transfer Data Augmentation. And this is work that is inspired by, like in many other things in NLP, by work that we see in computer vision. And so there's a reference here to the idea where we borrow some of the work that we present here. But basically, you know, we assume that you have labeled data in a source domain that is plentiful, like in this case, onto nodes or the very well-known kernel 20-year-old corpus. And our target domain, in this case, is social media data. And then you can see here some examples where the example one is from onto nodes, is newswire data. It's like no well formatted, long sentences, nice grammar, punctuation. And we care about doing name entity recognition in social media data. And so here you have shorter data, you have more fluid grammar, huge vocabulary, because now we're talking about social media that represents a lot of the worldwide population or some segment of the worldwide population. And so our idea is, well, can we learn how to transform this newswire data into data that looks more like social media data, and then use that transformed data to train a model and do better. That's the whole idea. So the work I'm going to present here is how we go about trying to achieve this. So the first approach has two main components for the modeling. We have a generator that does what we call denoising reconstruction. So in this part of the system, what we try to do is to add noise to our source data and our target data, and then train a model to remove the noise. And we know that, right? Because the pre-trained models have also been trained with this denoising kind of approach. And the hope is that because we use the shared model to do this denoising, that we're hoping that the model is learning some mapping from the different domains. Then we use the same model to do the transforming reconstruction, where we train a model, we take the model that was pre-trained doing this denoising, and then we're going to further train the model so that we use it to transform from source sentence and target sentence to the opposite. So a target sentence will be mapped to the source domain. A source domain sentence will be mapped to a target domain. And I'll show you a graph of how this works. And we use adversarial learning so that we have a discriminator module that is trying to predict whether a sentence is source domain or target domain, and our encoder-decoder approach is trying to fool the discriminator. So here's a diagram of how that works. We take pairs of sentences in source and target. They're not parallel. They're sentences that are from the domains of interest, but they actually may not be even related or have anything in common. We map those sentences to their corresponding embedding representation, and then we give that to the, in the top part, to the share encoder. The share encoder generates some of these have been transformed with noise, and then the share encoder generates some latent representation for them, gives them to the decoder. The decoder is trying to remove the noise and generate the original input sentence. And then similarly, given the input, the latent representation to the discriminator, this is the one that's trying to learn whether it's source or target. And the bottom part, we have this model that has been pre-trained to do this, and now it's going to help us do the transformation into source and target. So we take, again, pairs of sentences, source and target, map them to, take them to this encoder-decoder model, generate a transformed version that we hope they're already moving into the target and source domain. We map those through the embedding domain, the embedding layer for the corresponding domains. And then we give out to an encoder-decoder that is trying to recover the original sentence that has been transformed. And here we'll have the same domain classification using adversarial training so that we can sort of do that. So that's a high level, but there's a more detailed explanation of what we're doing here. So this is zooming into the first part of the component, the denoising reconstruction, where again, what we're trying to do is just train a model that takes source and target domain sentences that have been morphed in some way with noise added, like shuffled words, drop by words, masking words, and is trained with the goal of trying to generate the original sentence. Because it's a share encoder model, then we believe that that model is learning some shared representation and will help us map. Yes?
How do you choose the dimensionality for the shared representation, just experiments in different models?
Yes, so these are BERT embeddings, right? So they have the same dimensionality. The lookup tables it's just from the different domains.
Okay.
But the encoder decoders are VLSTM models, and the actual dimensions are in the paper.
Okay. Yeah.
But,
yeah.
And the domain classifier is just a linear layer.
Okay.
Yeah, so here we're just trying to train the model to remove the noise and map sentences. But again, we're passing target and source sentences. And so we hope that is helping the model acquire some alignment between the two domains. Then this is the domain classification. It's just a binary task. Can we predict source or target based on the latent representation generated by the encoder? So that's that part. Then the second part is the detransforming reconstruction. And here is where we train this M sub theta is the model that I just mentioned before. So first we train the model, then we take it here, and then we continue fine-tuning the model to do the rest of the task. So that's transforming from source to target and target to source, and then trying to extract the original ones after we pass them to the new encoder-decoder. And then again, we have a domain classifier here. This again, we have the domain classifier. It's just showing that we do another pass of the domain classification for this particular stage in the model. So putting it all together, the entire model has these three loss components, right? One coming from the noise, the denoising part, one coming from the deconstruction transformation, and then one for the adversarial. And then we learn the weights for each of them when we're training the whole thing. So that's the idea for the data augmentation, right? On how we try to use style. Now we need to see whether it works. And so for our downstream performance task is named entity recognition. So when we want to do that, we have to solve first the problem how we handle data augmentation for NER. So data augmentation traditionally comes, the idea, I believe it was borrowed from computer vision, where doing data augmentation is very trivial because you want to generate additional images that have the same class. You morph them. You can transform the image and the label will stay the same. You can revert the image, you can add noise, you can add color, whatever, but the label stays the same. And for some text processing tasks, you can do something very similar. For example, text classification. You can do back translation, right? That's a very common thing to do. You pass the sentences through many channels of translations, and at the end you end up with a sentence that is similar, but that you know has the same label, right? So that's very trivial. But for NER and sequence labeling tasks, the labels are granular, right? So it becomes a little bit more complicated to do data augmentation because if you want it to work, you want to keep track of the labels, right? And so you have to solve this problem. So what we do, for this, we want to avoid transformations that are not going to be sensical or transformations that are not going to preserve labels. And so we have to do linearization, right? And this was done before. So we linearize the labels. And one format of that is that we prepend the labels and we interleave them with the words. And so here's an example of a sentence taken from the same corpus. And then this is how we will linearize the sentence, right? We add special beginning of sentence and end of sentence tokens, and then we prepend the labels to each word, right? So in this case, that means that the word that follows this special tag is actually the beginning of a location named entity, and so on and so forth. So we expect that with that, the model that is trained to generate sentences is going to be able to provide us with labeled data that is actually good to train an NER system. The data sets we use to evaluate whether our approach works are OntoNotes 5.0 and the temporal Twitter data set from Rick Warney and Daniel. And the domains we have there, OntoNotes is mostly chess broadcast, news, conversation data. And then the temporal Twitter data is a social media. So we consider like OntoNotes is domain 1, even though inside of OntoNotes, and we're going to see the experiments, there are subdomains represented in OntoNotes. We consider that like the main difference will be social media versus non-social media, even though we explore what happens within the subdomains. And then the entity tags that we have there, this is a collective of the named entity tags. That doesn't mean that all the data sets are annotated with these entity tags. It's just that we lump them together. These are the set of classes that we're going to have. Now for evaluation, we need an NER system. So that we want to train with our data augmentation model. And it's a traditional BERT model with a linear layer. We don't really care much about, what is the actual NER. We want to compare what happens before and after we do data augmentation. And so for each source target pair that we compare, we have results with this NER using only the source domain, using only the target domain, and using the generated data plus the source domain that we call GEN, and those are the results that we're going to see. So here, these very horrible looking tables, we have evaluation numbers for the different data sets, and we're showing micro F score. So if you look at here, this column is the domain pair. So N, W, and going to the other, what is the domain? The broadcast conversation, right? So this will be the direction and we're going. In this case, your left side domain is the source, your right side domain is your target. This is the experiments we do. So this is when we only train the model with the source domain, when we train the model with the combination in the middle, and when we train the model with only the target domain. Okay, so this is the order for each set of experiments. And then we show experiments with different numbers of training samples. If we only take 1K samples for training, 2K, 3K, 4K, what happens? And column gain is the difference between what happens with our model and this one, the one that we have with only source. Obviously, these the last column in each set of experiments is our upper upper limit, right? This is the best you can do if you take target domain data and you train the model. And then your first row is your lower bound. If we just have source data and we train the model on only source data, what happens? And so we always hope to be somewhere in between, but obviously as close to the bottom as possible, right? But at least do better than the first one. And in most of the cases, that is what we're showing here. You see the numbers in blue, but here it is not the case. One pattern that we notice if you look at column similarity here is that the more similar the two source and target domains are, then the less benefit you get from doing this data augmentation process. And it's probably likely because there's not much signal there to learn, and the discriminator and the encoder model are not being able to take advantage of what is happening there because the domains are so close. So if you look at when the similarity is smaller, right, when you have more differences between them, then the gains of using our data augmentation approach versus not are higher. And all the results on the right side are better gains with our model than on the left side, because the left side is starting with the newswire data and going in the other direction, except for here, right? This is the largest because these two domains are the most different between them, right? But we get the most if we go from social media to web data. So this is one set of results. I'm not sure if you guys have questions. Yes. The overlap in named entities. I mean, there are many ways you can measure. Maybe this is not the best one, but because we're doing NER, that we're saying, okay, so how much overlap do we have between the named entities? Yes.
So if you're looking at the downstream performance, I was wondering if you were to look at things like the semantic preservation of sound, but how good is that by itself?
Yeah. We don't do this. I want to talk about the next iteration where we do. We do measure, though, the perplexity of reconstructing the sentences for our model. And we find the same pattern. We have lower perplexity when the domains are more different. We get better results. But yeah, that's a good point, and that's what we do next. Okay. We also compare with previous work, right? Because we're not the first ones to try to do data augmentation for NER. The simplest approaches are rule-based transformations you can do to the data, like keyboard changes. If you change some letters based on proximity on keyboard, right? Likely changes based on that. Or synonym transformations, swapping words, deleting words, and doing spelling mistakes, and using context as well based on Bert and Benny's proximity. That's I guess, the most sophisticated of that part of work. And then you have approaches like the DAGA approach from recent work, where they also use a generator to try to learn how to do data augmentation, and they use for NER with a language model. But we compare against them, and we're going to see that we get better results than what we see for them. I believe that not sure. I think data augmentation, the DAGA paper, is not doing cross domain. So one thing that is different is you can do data augmentation but stay within the same domain. But we're moving across domains here as well, where we go from newswire to social media to newswire. So here are the comparisons with very recent work and the simple transformations and the baseline where you do no augmentation. And overall, you can see that our approach is giving better results than state-of-the-art, and better results than the simple transformations. So this approach seems to be reasonable, but it also doesn't solve completely the problem. And we have this weird problem where we are sending pairs of sentences in source and target, but really there's no alignment between them. Like ideally, if you really want to extract the style, you want to get rid of the other distractors for the model. In this case, we may be giving sentences that are semantically very different, right? And the only thing that they have in common is that maybe they have named entity labels among them for some of the data sets. And so we have this concern on how do we actually remove those confounding factors and allow the model to focus more directly on just the style. So that's the next thing that we do. We want to work on a better alignment and have more control on the type of data that is generated. I didn't mention this, but in this previous work, we do see issues of invalid data that we have to throw away because we don't have the right format. Like, for example, you may see an I tag by itself or like before any B tags, right? So it's incoherent, you can throw it away. So we want to work on this, and this is what the next iteration of the work is looking at. So we call it unsupervised, the work that I presented, because we really don't have supervision signal for the style extraction. All we assume is that because we have a sharing encoder decoder, then there's going to be some alignment, and we hope that that works, and it kind of sort of works. But now we say, okay, so let's just do directly style transfer supervision. Can we do better? And that's what we're trying to do here. So we assume, as opposed to the previous work, that now we have parallel style data, not on the task that we care, so not on the downstream task, but at least we have parallel style sentences that are going in the direction of the domains that we care about. And we can use that to train a model and then use that model to generate data. And we also work with a large pre-trained generative model for this, so that we can take advantage of these powerful transformer models. So now we have to do sentence linearization again, but now we do it a little bit different. So instead of how I was doing it that I mentioned before, we try to reduce the amount of tags that we add to the model. So we still have the beginning of sentence and end of sentence tags, but now we just denote with the start and end the boundaries for the named entities. We don't attach a special tag before each of the words, only at the beginning and at the end of that named entity. So this is how our linearization works right now. For this modeling, we have a generator and a discriminator as well. That the generator is going to do paraphrase generation. So now we call it paraphrase generation, where we're doing the style morpheme, and then cycle consistent reconstruction, where we use that to actually go a model that learns from the paraphrase to go back to the original, where paraphrasing is just looking at the style. And then a domain classification. So we still use adversarial learning here. So here's a diagram of the model overview that we have for the second iteration of our work. So the left-hand side, we have your pre-trained language model, and that is being fine-tuned to do paraphrase generation, where we give the input sentence and a prefix that is denoting the direction of the transfer, maybe from social media to Newswire, or from Newswire to social media, so the model knows. And then it's fine-tuned to do the paraphrasing using the style. And again, we have the label data, parallel line data for doing this. And then here we introduce the adversarial learning for domain classification at that phase. Then on the other phase, we take the model that we're going to do transforming the pairs of sentences. But here's where we have the labeled data, right, for the task. We try to generate data that has labels, and we use the generator to transform from the original sentence with the corresponding prefix that is saying, okay, when you transform from source to domain, from source to target, and you map it, generate a linear representation, then you give this to another model with a different prefix, or the output of the decoder. This is the transform version. You add the prefix, but now the prefix is going to be the inverse direction, because now you want to go back with this in the generated model so that you can eventually reconstruct the input. But this model is trained in both directions, so it goes from target to source, from source to target. So hopefully that was a little bit clear. So this is the style paraphrasing that I just mentioned. Nothing really that complicated. You just have, we take the latent representation. This is your pre-trained model, and we just add these additional loss components so that we do adversarial training, and the model is learning to do paraphrase generation using style, but also train so that it can fool the domain classifier. And this is the cycle consistent reconstruction. It's like the same thing that I just mentioned. And we have, again, at the same time that we're training this module, we are training the domain classifier to do the whole process. Now, the one thing also that is different here is we have a pre-trained model, and decoding, if you have worked with these models, is you have multiple things that you can do there. Decoding, in this case, we look at it more carefully because, again, it's labeled data, and we need to pay extra attention to how the data is generated so that we have consistent and appropriate labeled data. So we use constraint decoding. We use a tree, which is use a special decoding mechanism so that a sentence can be generated by opening the beginning of sentence, right? But then you have options on what you're going to do next. What do you allow the model to look at next? And so the model can decide to go and generate just a regular word out of your text vocabulary, or the model can decide to enter and start generating a beginning of entity. And if you go down that path, then you have, you have possible. So we restrict how we do decoding, right? Constraint decoding to so that we end up with valid sentences. But related to the question that was posed earlier here, we want to sort of have a mechanism to filter sentences, because these language models can generate sometimes very repetitive, sometimes inconsistent. So in order to improve the quality of generated data, we have these measures to rank and assess which data we're going to actually take and use for our model. So we measure consistency. How consistent is the resulting sentence with the original one that was input to the model? We look at adequacy, like is this properly sentences, like do we consider that they are proper sentences according to natural language and pre-trained model. We measure fluency, and then we also measure diversity. So some of these metrics are conflicting with each other, with consistency, with diversity, right? Because on the one hand, paraphrase or transforming the style should generate something that is different from the input, but on the other hand, you don't really want it to be that different, because if it's too different, then probably not doing it right. And so we use this combination of metrics so that we can rank what is being generated. The data set that we use for the parallel style, these again are not labeled for named entity. These are just so that we can train a model to paraphrase in the correct domains. We use these data sets from Rao and Tetrao. And for the social media data, we use, again, Thamar Twitter. For the ontonodes, for the other domain, we use ontonodes. And that allows us to compare with previous work, but also compare us against ourselves, what we did before. For the base models, for styles transfer, we use a T5 base model that is fine-tuned for this. And then the NER system is the same. It's just a BERT plus a linear layer. So that this is a huge table with results of what we did. This is going direction. It shows here the direction from one to the next, so from Newswire or British Corpus to social media. This row is the source, is the baseline system. Like, this is what the system will achieve, this NER system, if it's trained only on source data. These are previous recent works that are doing similar, that are in the same space, and we're comparing against, and this is ours. This is our system. It changed names from one version to the next, but this is the one that I just talked about. So we're comparing against, and this is another system that came along the same time. Then for this particular setting, we explore fusion setting, low resource setting, and full set setting. So when we have different regimes of training data available, and in this is where we have the full setting. This is continues to be our upper bound. Like, if we have enough data in our target domain, or if we use all the data available in a target domain, then this is how we can do. And you can look at the numbers, but I guess what's more important is the trend that we see here, that in the row for our approach, we're outperforming our previous work in other previous papers. And we're definitely doing better than the baseline system. Even even in the future setting, we do better. So here's, I guess I forgot that I zoom into the table because it's a horrible table, but here's like, if you look at only future setting, this is what we do, but it's the same numbers. It's just that I partitioned the table because it looked too big. But the trends are the same. You can look at the numbers, but I think numbers are not really that relevant. So here we did another experiment because now we have a system that can generate data, then we can potentially just generate a lot of data, right? And how good is that? So we did a comparison where we generate different amounts of data to train the model. So here's the x-axis is the number of generated samples by our model. And this is the F-score for a system that is trained on that amount of data to do NER. The green line here, source to target, is showing what happens if we train the model on source and then test on target. The curve here is when we're training the model on the generated data and the target data, right? But increasing amounts of generated data. The blue line is when we combine source and target to train the model. So this is also a fixed line because the amount of data doesn't change. And the red line in the middle is what happens when we train on only the target data. And then the direction, each of these plots is a specific direction of one domain to the next. And as you can see, we, in this particular line, the other models do better when we have less automatically generated data. But as you add more data, then the results are better. So more data in this case helps. We don't extend further than that because then it starts the performance plateaus after some point. But at least it shows that when we're doing this combination and training the model on more amounts of automatically generated data, you get better results, which I think is practical because generating this data is very cheap, right? So here are some cherry pick examples on what the sentences look like for this later model. This is the original sentence in the formal domain, and this is what is coming out of the model that is trying to learn how to map to an informal domain. So like, it's nice that, oh yes, it's come to, it's transformed to yeah, I think that's pretty cool. And I think those are the kinds of things that you learn from these labeled parallel style data, right? Because now the model, again, you control for the semantics, the sentences have the same meaning, and the only thing that changes is the style. So the model is better able to extract the style. Obviously, there are sentences that are horrible, just showing the pretty ones. But yeah, not all the sentences are that nice, right? So in conclusion, we do style transfer for data augmentation. We show that it improves downstream task performance. It alleviates a little bit of the issues of having low resource scenarios. I think this could be applied to other downstream tasks. We want to extend this work to multilingual settings. All of this work was done only on English and only mapping from one domain in English to another domain in English, but it will be super interesting to see how we can do that across languages. And then explore other tasks, like maybe even for test classification, this will be much easier because you don't have to deal with the linearization problem. And I want to make sure that I acknowledge my student, Shugang Chen, and my collaborators. All this work is Shugang's work, and I'm just here to talk about it. So yeah, big thanks to my students. Questions do you have? I'm ready for more questions.
Have you looked at all into like distillation models, which are like all in the range for doing style transfer? That's like sort of the generator discriminator component.
Yeah, no.
Okay.
Yeah, that'll be good to explore. Hopefully, my student will have a chance.
Yeah. I mean, they just explode
Yeah.
now, so I figured I'd yet.
Yeah.
I'm interested in hearing more about like the different kind of linearization strategies, and also to what extent you could imagine this kind of working for something that has like structured representation on top of so like NER tags being more like a linear like tag representation, that you could have something like nested tags or something, and then the linearization problem becomes trickier. Have you looked at that at all in terms of like next steps, or?
That's an interesting problem. What I would do if I had to look at that is that I will have a placement tag for the substructure and generate the outer part, right, the high level one, and then go and expand those. And you know, I would do it in steps. Linearization, yeah, and even how we decode, even not just for data augmentation, but in general for sequence labeling tasks. If you think about how we evaluate and benchmark pre-trained language models, there's very little for sequence labeling tasks, very little work. And these huge models are benchmarked on a lot of different tasks like machine translation, common sense, and inference, but not sequence labeling tasks. So we really know very little. But there's a recent work that uses also T5 for NER, just the NER part. And their linearization, what they do is they actually avoid having to upload the words. And instead, when they give the input to the model, they actually have these sentinel tokens they give the model. So sentinel tokens are position based. So the sentinel token for the word at position 1, and then the word, and then the label when they give it as input, but they train the model to generate only the sentinel tokens and the label. But that's a different problem. But I think it's very interesting because you get it removes the it controls a little bit the hallucination problem, because the model is not forced to generate the actual input words. It's just generating sentinel words. And the authors show that you get better performance. Yeah.
In the first supervised case, we said that there are a lot of invalidations. Like, how did you do that check? Is it automatic, or is it just like a manual?
So some things you can do automatic, right? Because you can filter things where they start with an I. Everything that starts with an I is going to be filtered. More problem we saw in the first part of the work is like repetitions and sentences that were coming out just very similar to the input. And so that's why we thought we need some mechanisms to filter. We need something automatic that can qualify the sentences, because you can generate, generation is inexpensive. But if you know how to automatically clean them and select them, then that will be super helpful.
So you mentioned that even in the second project, there were a lot of sentences that were not of best quality. Do you think the model is learning despite the bad examples, or maybe you have to sort of see some bad quality text actually helps getting a target like social media, but that's like also happen?
That's an interesting point. I will have to look at the data carefully to see, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's because the variety, the model is looking at more diversely construct sentences that is helping. But yeah, we'll have to look at that. That's a nice thought. Yeah.
So another thing I was thinking of is like, do you have a sense of the kind of performance improvements of this approach, where you're kind of doing the tagging in the same step as the transfer, as compared to something like training like a sequence to sequence paraphrase model and then doing word alignment and propagating, like having just noisy kind of silver data using word alignments across the paraphrases to propagate the NER tags? Is that like would that be like a comparable setting? Or
that's an interesting thought. So I'm not really sure they did how would you go about doing that without separating the NER? I guess you give pairs of sentences. You're thinking about pairs of sentences, and then the model gives you the output, the labeled target sentence.
Yeah, so you would have you'd have your training data on like the news corpus,
Yeah.
and you have a paraphrase model that can transfer the news corpus sentences
Mhm.
to a different style,
Mhm.
and then you use a word alignment model to take the NER tags from the news corpus to the style transferred version of that corpus, and then you train on that. And then at test time, you get some social media post, and you can NER tag it because you trained on like the NER tag news data, but in the style of the social media posts.
I think I'm missing something there. Because it kind of, okay. So you're just doing the generation part. You're generating label data.
Yeah, yeah.
But we are generating label data. I guess the question is, because you use that data to train the NER model, I guess the question will be whether we evaluate the accuracy of the NER at that stage. We don't do that. I'm just trying to think how we do that. We will need, in order to evaluate that, which I think is helpful, we will need to label those
Right.
data sets.
Yeah,
Unless we do some sort of, like you mentioned, we follow along and keep track of which words belong to what. Yeah. I'm not, yeah, we should probably look into that, because that would be helpful to know what accuracy you get in that model.
Yeah.
And if you need, but if you get rid of the NER component altogether, and you just want to give sentences, it will be, yeah, I mean, it might be, I'm not sure, because you're adding the style mapping and the NER, so your input doesn't have, your target doesn't have the labels, only the source has labels, and when you send it over, you want to just add the labels.
Yeah, you just use like word alignments to take the label for like this token. You see that this token is aligned to this token.
Yeah.
In the output, and so
Yeah.
that token had
Yeah.
a person tag.
Okay.
In the
The problem why we cannot do that experiment and evaluate right now is because we don't have any other data that is parallel in style.
Right, so you have no way of evaluating the quality of the projected data.
Yeah. But we should, that would be good to look into it.
All right, let's thank Professor Solorio one more time.